24. We're going to jump over. We finished up with chapter 19 last week. And we're going to jump over into chapter 24. And if you want to go through and read, chapters 20, 21, or chapter 21, kind of 22, just more fleshing out of the law a lot. If you just kind of scan through, you can kind of see some of the things he's asking or he's going to require of the Israelites to do. Talking about some of the enemies that they're going to be facing soon as well, and kind of how he's going to be driving them out. And so on and so forth, okay? But for the sake of the I ams, which is what kind of going through Exodus into Deuteronomy, we're going to kind of start heading that direction now. We're going to get into the next one, which I am glorious God. I am the glorious God. So now that we have the covenant, now that we have the law given to the Israelites, now we're going to move into, and of course, over in chapter 19, we saw the Israelites who got the Ten Commandments and had this covenant that made this Mosaic covenant made with them, that if you do these things, essentially I'm going to bless you and take care of you. We saw that all of the Israelites, as a collective, what was their response to this covenant? What did they say? They agreed, right? All of them collectively said, yes, we'll do this. All right, we agreed to this covenant, the demands of this covenant, and we agreed to do all that you have commanded us to do, okay? So now we get to chapter 24, and what we're going to see here is that the people are going to officially ratify this covenant with God, okay? And they're going to do this at Mount Sinai where they're at. So, I guess we know when you ratify something, it kind of makes it official, right? And makes it kind of puts it, not the paper, but puts it in to where people are going to follow it, and we know it make it the law of the land, essentially, for the Israelites. So the first 8 verses here in chapter 24, we're going to see the beginning of this ratification of this covenant, and we're going to see again the mentioning of what the covenant is. And God's covenant and exactly kind of what this means for the Israelites to ratify this covenant. All right. So the first couple of verses, what we're going to see is God is going to give Moses some instructions, as he has been doing now for quite some time, and he's going to instruct Moses to have some of his people who help him, some of his aides, to kind of come up with him to Mount Sinai. But they had to, again, first meet with Israel to ratify this covenant. All right, so let's start with chapter 24, and let's read the first 8 verses of chapter 24. And he said unto Moses, Come up unto the Lord, thou and Aaron and Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and worship ye afar off. And Moses alone shall come near the Lord, but they shall not come nigh, neither shall the people go up with him. And Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord, and all the judgments, and all the people answered with one voice, and said, All the words which the Lord hath said we will do. And Moses wrote all the words of the Lord, and rose up early in the morning, and builded an altar under the hill, and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent young men of the children of Israel, which offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen unto the Lord. And Moses took half of the blood and put it in the basins, and half of the blood he sprinkled on the altar. And he took the book of the covenant and read in the audience of the people. And they said, All that the Lord hath said we will do, and be obedient. And Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people, and said, Behold the blood of the covenant, which the Lord hath made with you concerning all these words. So God instructs Moses and his aides or the helpers to come to him to Mount Sinai, have to first meet, though, there to ratify the covenant, as we see in the first couple of verses of chapter 24. Moses then communicates everything God had told him, right? He communicates all of the words of the Lord's as well as all of the judgment, right? Verse 3, he goes and tells the people all of the covenant, okay? He then tells them the consequences for not following the covenant, right? So he gives them everything. They now know where they stand and what is required and what God expects, okay? So he tells them all the things. And as we see in the end of verse 3, once again, the people, all of the Israelites, who would have been several hundred thousands, if not probably over 1 million people here, answering with one voice, as we see in verse 3, and said, all the words which the Lord hath said we will do. Okay? So they are accepting the covenant as a nation to follow the law, follow the covenant, that God has just given them. Okay? Moses recorded, as we see, all the words of the Lord and made an altar at the foot of Sinai. So Moses goes in verse 4 and writes all this stuff down in a book, in a scroll, or whatever what they were writing on at the time. We see Moses taking and writing all these things down. This would probably obviously taken Moses, and didn't just knock it out like we were able to type it out. Now, this would have taken him some time. But he recorded all of it. And once he was done, we see him building this altar and setting up the 12 pillars, of course, the pillars for each of one of the tribes of Israel. And then he sends off the young men to burnt offerings and peace offerings. And these young men here would have been the firstborn sons of the tribes here who would have played the roles of priests until the priesthood of Aaron is set up here in a little bit, okay? So that's who these young men were, firstborn sons who were kind of acting as priests. In the role of priest until we get the actual priesthood set up here in the next little bit, okay? So that's who that was. And then we get to verse 6 and we see the actual ratification process happen, all right? And we see Moses taking the blood from the sacrifice and he put it into bowls or into basins. And he took half the blood and sprinkled it on the altar. And then he took the other half of the blood and sprinkled it on the what? The writing of the covenant that he had just done. Okay? So sprinkles it there, and then we once again, I think this is very important, we once again at the end of verse 7, what do we see the Israelites doing? The very end of verse 7, what do they do?
Pledging obedience.
Again, right? So this is twice now in a very short period of time. We see the Israelites saying, everything God says we will be obedient to, right? We see them saying it as a collective here. All of them are agreeing to be obedient to this covenant. Now, we know that just in a short few chapters what's going to happen. They're going to start to not follow these things, right? But as of right now, where they're standing, where they're at, and where we're at in this story, they are fully invested and fully committed here to being obedient to God and following through with this covenant. Okay? So once they again agree, continue to ratify this covenant, verse 8, we see the continued process here by Moses, and he sprinkles the people with some of the blood as well. Right? Verse 8, and Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people, and said, behold, the blood of the covenant which the Lord hath made with you concerning all of these words. Okay? So we take some of the same blood, sprinkles on the people, and maybe the people here were, represented by the 12 pillars. Practically speaking, trying to sprinkle blood over 2 million people would have been not only difficult, but would have taken a very, very long time. It's probably why the pillars were set up in symbol of each of the tribe. So we probably actually sprinkled it onto the pillars. Either way, maybe he took the time and sprinkled it on all 2 million people. Who knows? Either way, though, what we see is a very clear connection, right, between sacrifice and the people. That's the whole point here. A very clear connection between the sacrifice and the people. And the blood used during the sacrifice on the people was a blood oath, right? So it means they were bound to obey the Lord. This was the greatest of oaths here, bound to obey the Lord. The blood on the altar then was a symbol of God's acceptance of the offering and then the forgiveness he granted as a result. Okay, this is, of course, just a prefigured symbol of Christ's shed blood on behalf of humanity. And if you will, jump over to Hebrews chapter 9 with me. Go to verse 11. We're going to read down to verse 15. And we'll see here the correlation. But Christ, being come on high priest of good things to come by a greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, it is to say, not of this building. Neither by the blood of goats and calves, but by his own blood he entered into the holy place, having obtained eternal redemption for us. For if the blood of bulls and of goats and the ashes of heifer sprinklings of the unclean sanctifieth the purifying of the flesh, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, purge your conscience from dead works to serve the living God. And for this cause he is the mediator of the New Testament, that by means of death for the redemption of the transgressions that were under the first testament, they which are called might receive the promise of eternal inheritance. So we see the correlation here of Christ's blood and how it covered and what's we see the prefigured shedding of blood here in the Mosaic covenant. Now, how would you describe at this point in time? Okay, take out what you know, take out what we've seen. Just at this point in time, look at just this snapshot, this Polaroid of the Israelites. How would you describe their relationship with God? Just at this moment, how would you describe the relationship with God? We've seen twice now, just in this chapter. Them doing what? Being obedient, right? Being obedient. Going to be loyal. Ready to be loyal to him and to obey him, probably out of the gratitude for everything that he has done for them, right? Just the Israelites in a good spot right now, okay? And that's where they're at, and that's how we see them. Now, we get to verse 9 of chapter 24, and we see God's glorious presence. Okay? Now that this ratification process is over, Moses and his aides, that being including Joshua, as we're going to see, head up Mount Sinai to meet with God. And they witnessed some pretty awesome things in the middle of this. Go to verse 9. Then went up Moses and Aaron and Nadab and Abihu and 70 of the elders of Israel. And they saw the God of Israel, and there was under his feet, as it were, a paved work of a sapphire stone, and as it were the body of heaven in its clearness. And upon the nobles of the children of Israel he laid not his hand, and they saw God, and did eat and drink. And the Lord said unto Moses, Come up to me into the mount, and be there, and I will give thee tablets of stone, and a law, and commandments which I have written, that thou mayest teach them. And Moses rose up, and his minister Joshua, and Moses went up into the mount of God. And he said unto the elders, Tarry ye here for us until we come again unto you, and behold, Aaron and Hur are with you. If any man have any matter to do, let him come unto them. And Moses went up into the mount, and a cloud covered the mount, And the glory of the Lord abode upon Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it for 6 days. And the seventh day he called unto Moses out of the midst of the cloud. And the sight of the glory of the Lord was like devouring fire on the top of the mountain in the eyes of the children of Israel. And Moses went into the midst of the cloud, and gat him up into the mount. And Moses was in the mount 40 days and 40 nights. So Moses here and his aides, again including Joshua, head up to Mount Sinai to meet with the Lord. And as they did, they witnessed an appearance by God. Now, of course, God was not there in all of his glory, because they couldn't handle that, right? Couldn't handle all of his glory. None of them would have been able to survive quite that revelation. But they did get a glimpse of him. Probably even a quick glimpse of him. And within just that quick glimpse of him, we see how he is described in verses 9 and 10, right? They went up, and in verse 10, they saw the God of Israel, and there was under his feet what? As it were, sapphire, right? Sapphire that was so pure, it appeared to be something from heaven. Okay, the purest sapphire that probably was ever sapphired was standing here, and what God appeared to be standing on. And it was so clear, they probably really weren't able to describe it exactly how clear it was. That Moses is doing the best he can here as he's writing this down. And that was just a small glimpse of the glory of God, right? Not even, probably just a minuscule part of it. So we can kind of see the majesty of God, and how he has to restrain and hold back all of his glory. So knowing that and seeing that now in verses 9 and 10, what might you expect God's appearance, or how might you affect God's appearance to have an effect on Aaron's understanding of God? Right. So Aaron's one of the people that saw him. We know he's going to be the high priest. Seeing this small glimmer and seeing this what appears to be sapphire that God's standing on, how would you expect that to affect Aaron's understanding of God? What should it have changed or maybe fortified? The realness of him, and what else? With the realness becomes what? Realness follows by reverence, right? Realness of God should always follow by reverence. It should have increased his reverence. It should have given him a keen sense of seriousness to what was happening there on Mount Sinai. Right? This was a big event. This was a major thing taking place. And Aaron getting to see a small glimpse of maybe God's pinky toe on standing on sapphire should have really increased just how serious this was to him. Okay? God accepted the men, and then, of course, mercifully restrained his hand from striking the men dead. The men responded to God's revelation of his glory by eating a meal together, a common occurrence for ratification of a covenant in those days. Verse 11 there, right? And upon the nobles of the children of Israel, he laid not his hand. Also they saw God and did eat and drink. So God could have struck them dead, did not. Chose not to, restrained himself from doing that. So they had a meal to kind of, as anybody does, I guess, have a meal, sit down after a covenant, and kind of just as a finality to the covenant there, celebration of it. Now we get to verse 12, we see God calling Moses and Joshua. Now, why do you think God called Joshua in the midst of this too?
He's going to take Moses.
Yeah, does Moses know that yet? No, right? Does Joshua know that yet? No, but God does, right? And God wants to get Joshua in on what's happening here, right? Kind of go ahead, beginning to prepare him. We see God starting to prepare Joshua many years before that he's going to come in and take over for Moses. So these two men go higher up into the mountain, leave the Aaron and the elders and her. And of course, eventually we see Moses leaving Joshua as well. And as he continues up the mountain to meet with the Lord, he's going to receive these tablets, these 10 commandments, which God is going to write down for him. And then after 6 days, the Lord calls Moses out of the cloud that accompanies his presence to the people at the base of Mount Sinai. God's glory appeared on the mountain as a consuming fire. Right? So if we continue to read down, starting in verse 12 again, the Lord saw, come up unto me into the mount, and be there, and I will give thee the tablets of stone, and the law and command which I have written, that thou mayest teaching them. Moses rose up and his minister Joshua, and Moses went up to the mount, and he said unto the elders, tarry here for us until we come again unto you. Behold, Aaron and Hur with you. If any man have any matters to do, let him come unto them. And Moses went up the mount, and the cloud covered the mount. And the glory of the Lord abode at Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it 6 days. So Moses went up away from Aaron and Hur for 6 days, right? He was there. He wasn't actually in the actual presence of God. God has to call him forth, right, out of the cloud. So Moses has to just be there for 6 days. Doing who knows what, right? But he was there. He was waiting on God. Just probably literally sitting there waiting on God, and waiting on God's time. Continuing, and God's doing this here, he's continuing to teach Moses, right? He's continuing to teach him more and more lessons, and continuing to prepare him for continuing of him leading these people for the years he's going to lead them. God could have very easily just brought Moses right up, gave him the tablets, and sent him back down. But we're seeing this process here that God is putting Moses through to continue teaching patience and continue to teach him waiting. They needs to wait on God. And that things are not done on Moses' time, but are done in God's time. Okay, that's why we're continuing to see God have very certain things that are happening to Moses, because he's continuing to grow him more and more and more. So 6 days, he calls him out of the cloud that accompanies his presence. Now, if you were at the base of Mount Sinai, that cloud would have looked like what? It says so right there in verse 18? Verse 17, sorry. What's it say in verse 17? That cloud that Moses was sitting in looked like what to the people at the bottom of the mountain? Fire, right? It looked like fire around Mount Sinai. And not just any type of fire. It looked like a devouring fire. Like it looked like as if it was burning the mountain up before the eyes there of the children of Israel. Of course, we know that it wasn't, but to them it appears that it was just absolutely just burning up. In verse 18, we see Moses going in and meeting with God in the midst of the cloud, and came up to the mountain, and Moses was in the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. So, as this event, this ratification for the covenant is taking place, this is obviously a several-week process here. What is God revealing about himself by appearing to Israel as this all-consuming fire? What reason is God displaying himself as this consuming fire on Mount Sinai to the people of Israel? Why that, and why not something else? What does fire do to things? It purifies them, and also it either consumes them or purifies them, right? Depending on what it's burning. So God is using this display as a fire so that people continue to understand they need to revere him, take with seriousness the covenant that they are ratifying, and that the commands needed to be followed and followed seriously, or great consequences are going to come. Now, we get to chapter 25, and all the way through chapter 31, we see God's dwelling place. Okay, and these are the plans here, of course, for the tabernacle that dominated his new revelation here to Moses. This tabernacle that he is describing to Moses are the plans where God is going to dwell with Israel. It's got great importance. God gives Moses very specific instructions on how to build a tabernacle, gives him specific instructions on what furniture to put in it. He goes as far to tell Moses about each loop, each pole, each section, and each fabric that's going to make up the tabernacle. He even goes into great detail on how the furniture was to be made, right? Even the furniture that is being made has specific instructions. And of course, beginning with the Ark of the Covenant, and then the accompanying mercy seat as well. Look over at verse 21 and 22 of chapter 25. Now, we're not going to go through each of these chapters and go through the study of the tabernacle. I remember Grandpa doing a study of the tabernacle one time. I was probably I might have been early high school, and it took him like a long time to get through. Like the study of a tabernacle itself is an event. Like it would be a whole process to study. So we're not going to dig into that with this. We're going to kind of just talk a few things about it and then move on. But that's a study of itself. There are some really fine details that God goes into here when he's describing to Moses the tabernacle. We go to verse 21 and 22 of chapter 25. And we see the mercy seat, and we see the importance and why the mercy seat is so important. And thou shalt put the mercy seat above upon the ark. And in the ark thou shalt put the testimony that I shall give thee, and there I will meet with thee, and I will commune with thee, from above the mercy seat, from between the two cherubim, which are upon the ark of the testimony, of all things which I will give thee in commandment unto the children of Israel. Mercy seat is incredibly important, of course, because this was the place where He's going to dwell between the cherubim, and that's where the mercy seat. This is where God was going to sit. So this is why it had such great importance, and why He's dealt with great importance when describing it to Moses. The Ark of the Covenant mentioned as well was the place of atonement for Israel. Israel was accepted by God as a result of a substitute sacrifice. Therefore, their sins were covered temporarily because those sacrifices, of course, we know had to continue year after year after year. But the temporary atonement for sin was a precursor to Christ's final atonement for sins on the cross that we saw there over in Hebrews. Here is a little artist rendition of the two things, the mercy seat and where the Ark of the Covenant would have been placed, and the mercy seat that is in between the two cherubims on the Ark of the Covenant. And if you look at verse 40 of chapter 25, with me please. And look that thou make them after their pattern, which was showed thee in the mount. Now jump over to verse 30 of chapter 26. And thou shalt rear up the tabernacle according to the fashion thereof, which was showed thee in the mount. How important here are these details that God is spelling out for Moses in Mount Sinai? Extremely important, right? This is where God is going to sit. Okay? This is God, the entity that his pinky toe was sapphires, the purest sapphires ever seen. This is where he's going to come into commune with man, right? With the priests. This is important. The details had to be perfect. Okay? Had to be exactly as God wanted them to be. That's why he's giving great instruction and giving great importance to the instructions that are being given to Moses. God's so specific about the tabernacle because it was Israel's means of approaching him. Israel was to approach him according to his plan. God's communication of all these details were part of the reason that Moses spent so much time on the mountain. He went in such great detail that's why it took so long. God ended his instructions on the tabernacle by repeating his command about keeping the Sabbath. Jump over to chapter 31 and go to verse 12. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak thou also unto the children of Israel, saying, Verily my Sabbaths shall ye keep. For it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that ye may know that I am the Lord that doth sanctify you. Ye shall keep the Sabbath, therefore, for it is holy unto you. Every one that defileth it shall be surely put to death. For whosoever doeth any work therein, that soul shall be cut off from among his people. 6 days may work be done, but in the seventh day is the Sabbath of rest, holy to the Lord. Whosoever doeth any work in the Sabbath day, he shall be surely put to death. Wherefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath throughout the generations, for a perpetual covenant. And it is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. And he gave unto Moses, when he had made an end, communing with him upon Mount Sinai, 2 tables of testimony, tables of stone, written with the finger of God. So he gives again several times there at the end of this, the importance of keeping the Sabbath, instructing them about how they needed to make sure they were keeping the Sabbath. He reminds Moses why there's a Sabbath, reminds Moses of the connection between the Sabbath day and the week of creation, and how God set that up, and it was the same thing that he did. And this connection was there to remind Moses and eventually the Israelites that they served not just a God that can part the Red Sea, not just a God that can make a mountain burn but not really burn, but the God that literally created everything. Right? That's why this connection is there. That's why the Sabbath is there. That's why God set that up in that way and was so emphatical on making sure they followed that same pattern. Okay? So they could remember that he was the, in fact, creator of the entire universe. We mentioned this before. There's no other God that has that in their pedigree. Right? None of them, the other false gods, the things that they did, in quotation marks, none of them has creation of the universe in their pedigree. Okay, that's why God is the one true living God. And it would make no sense for the Israelites, therefore, to worship anybody else. Because nobody else can match, right? Nobody else can live up. Nobody else can say they were able to do what God did. So after noting that, describing the importance of it again, God then takes 2 tablets of stone, and one of the coolest things I think that's in Scripture, he writes on with his finger the 10 Commandments, inscribes them into these 2 tablets, and gives them to Moses. Okay, which would have been Moses probably witnessed it and was probably pretty amazed to see exactly what happened. The old 10 Commandments Exodus movie from way back in, I guess, in the 70s, I guess it would have been, when that was a cool scene. You all probably seen that old, I can't think exactly what it's called. That was a really good. I remember being young and watching that thing. That was a really cool thing to see. And it would have been awesome for Moses to see. So now that Moses is carrying these 2 tablets, we get to chapter 32. And the scene kind of changes, right? So we go from this awesome stuff that's happening, the destruction of the tabernacle, God describing to Moses all the things that need to be done, how he's going to set up this way in which God can come and commune with the Israelites. All these great and amazing things are happening. And then we get to the beginning of chapter 32, we have a scene change, and we go down to see what the Israelites, now just 40 days removed from saying, yes, God will do whatever was required of us. 40 days removed, we get to chapter 32, and we see the rejection of the covenant. It doesn't take them very long at all. We'll get into that next week. We don't have time to do it today. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for the lesson. Thank you for the things written down here that Moses was able to see, Lord, and describe to us, Lord, and just to continue to show just the importance all of this, these commandments, this law, this instructions for the tabernacle, the covenant that was set up. And as we're studying this, and as we're reading this, and as we're looking back, and of course seeing the failures of the Israelites a lot of times, it never ceases to amaze me and to remind me of the importance of being obedient to you, and the importance of consequences for sin, and the magnitude with which you hate sin. And that should have an effect on the studier and the reader of this. No, we don't have the law anymore. No, you don't show up in this great fire. But you're the same God who wrote this law down for Moses, the same God that we serve today. As much as you hated sin then, you hate it equally as much now. And the covenant that we've made with you that says, yes, Lord, we'll follow, we'll obey, should be taken with great severity in our own lives, the importance of it. So if nothing else, through this, Lord, I pray this reminder to us that, first of all, what a mighty God we serve, and the importance of serving faithfully. Lord, I pray you don't forget it. If Pastor Robbie comes the next little bit as well, and just use him, Lord, in a mighty way, keeps attentive to the word that you've given him.